Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. Welcome back to the Caring Economy with me, Toby Usnik. Today is a joyful day for me because we have Darren Walker as our guest. Darren is a friend for decades here in New York, but also just a fantastic leader and an inspiration. Darren is the president of the Ford Foundation, the $16 billion, that's right, $16 billion international social justice philanthropy with offices in the United States and 10 regions around the globe. He has chaired the Philanthropy Committee that brought the resolution to the city of Detroit's historic bankruptcy. And under his leadership, the Ford Foundation became the first nonprofit in U.S. history to issue $1 billion in designated social bond in the U.S. capital markets for proceeds to strengthen and stabilize nonprofit organizations in the wake of COVID-19. And the list goes on. But we're going to jump right into it by first saying, welcome to the Caring Economy, my dear friend, Darren Walker.
Thank you, Toby. It's always a treat to be with you. You're a special friend and a very unique and remarkable individual.
You're sweet. I've said to many people, and I've told you I've said this before, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart, you're one of those rare breeds, and I can count on one hand, who I describe as born a happy baby. We all have our trials and tribulations and knocks in life, but I've always found you to be just inspiring and positive, and I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. So I'm honored to have you here today.
Thank you.
So now with that reference to, the happy baby, give us, as we always ask our guests, Darren, please give us like a 2-3 minute digest of your life, where you came from, how you were raised, maybe the pivots, however you found your way to this career path that you're on.
Well, I was born in rural Louisiana in a charity hospital to a single mother. We moved to a small town, Ames, Texas, population 1,200, when I was a toddler. Mm-hmm. And thus began my journey in Texas, my journey as a young, poor Black child in a country that at that time believed in the potential, the dreams of little girls and boys in small towns and big cities who might be poor, but who had potential. I was a Head Start baby, the first class in 1965 of Head Start. I attended public schools all the way through law school. I proudly say that I have never attended a day of private education in my life. I am a product of the idea that Horace Mann championed of an educated citizenry informed by and financed by primarily the public sector. Because I, in my lifetime, and certainly in my childhood, in spite of the difficulties I encountered, I always felt that my country was cheering me on, that America wanted me to win. And so it's true that I, according to my mother, have always been a happy person and was a happy baby. But that happiness was in part a function of the opportunity that I saw before me and the potential to get on the American mobility escalator and ride it as far, as high as my ambition and my commitment would take me.
Beautiful metaphor. I often talk about the military. I'm not a veteran, but I've seen the military as an escalator of sort as well, historically, where it's allowed people without access to education to actually get an education, get a career, get out and see the world. And that makes us better citizens, I think, because we need to have those opportunities. I love that metaphor you said of your nation cheering you on. Like, who doesn't deserve that, really?
Well, I believe today, unfortunately, Toby, that there are many Americans, white, Black, brown, poor, urban, and rural, who don't feel that they are being cheered on by their country. In fact, too many feel left out and left behind and marginalized. And that is part of the challenge that we face as a nation. There are too many disaffected Americans, and we need to come to grips with that reality. before it's too late, before our democracy is truly imperiled.
Mhm. Yeah, I want to talk more about polarization in a moment, but let's still finish the narrative for you. So after you are a UT grad, I believe you were actually your valedictorian in your graduating class. So is that
Well, I wasn't valedictorian in my graduating class. I think I was a good student, but I was not the valedictorian. I
okay?
was the person who was often deemed likely to succeed, but I think
Yeah,
that was a combination of things. My experience having leaving law school in Austin and coming to Wall Street
yeah,
was in part because I was a real go-getter.
yeah.
And I had both an ambition, an aspiration, and a determination, which I think are important ingredients for success, especially in a place like New York. But I
Especially.
did not come to New York to work for a foundation. I came to New York to work on Wall Street, and I wanted to
Mhm.
work in the private sector, first at Cleary Gottlieb, the law firm, and then at UBS, the bank, because I wanted, for the first time in my life, to understand what it felt like to not be poor,
Wow.
to have some modicum of financial security. And thus, I went to the private sector for 10 years.
Mhm.
I was lucky enough to meet on that journey the Reverend Dr. Calvin Butts III, who
Mhm.
was the great leader of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, the historic Abyssinian Church. And I became the chief operating officer of the Abyssinian Development Corporation, which was his and Karen Phillips' vision for a revitalized Harlem in
Mhm.
the 1980s and 90s, a time when Harlem looked very different than it does today. It's hard to imagine, Toby,
Yeah,
that there
I
was a
remember. I
time
remember.
when we couldn't get people to move to Harlem.
Right.
And so I joined Abyssinian in the early 90s, and my life was transformed. I moved from Midtown Manhattan to Harlem. It was, for me, an exhilarating moment, but uh, there was no supermarket, there were no restaurants to speak of, there was no dry cleaners.
Yeah.
The bodegas with the brown tomatoes and lettuce were basically all we had. And I learned a lot working at Abyssinian. I learned a lot working in the field of community development, of
Uh-huh.
building housing and commercial projects, and a public school. So it was a great experience in urban revitalization,
Mhm.
community-based leadership in that regard. And that's how I segued to the Rockefeller Foundation
Mhm.
and then to Ford. And
Sure.
here we are.
Yeah. And in that evolution, one of the things you've been now almost a decade, right, at Ford?
Indeed, I have been president 10 years. I joined Ford in 2010. For 3 years. I was vice president.
Well, happy anniversary and well done, you. What I've loved seeing you do there is really help transform or move the organization into a social justice focused organization. It's now even officially in your name. And I wonder if you might talk about um, the impetus for that and then how you got the team, so to speak, on board.
Well, for me, I was inspired when I first read Andrew Carnegie's seminal 1889 essay called The Gospel of Wealth, which laid out the principles of American philanthropy, the
Mhm.
idea of giving back. Carnegie popularized that phrase,
Mhm.
the notion of charity, of generosity, of root causes. Um, but Carnegie did not object to inequality. He didn't have a problem with inequality. He did not object to the norms of a racist society. The fact
Mhm.
that Blacks, for example, did not benefit from the Carnegie libraries as much as white Americans did. Was not a great concern of his, nor was it of most people in that era.
Yeah.
So he was no better or worse. It was a normative way in which American apartheid existed at that time.
Hmm.
Now, I when I became president of Ford, was searching for words that might embody how I thought about philanthropy. And
Hmm.
I came across a somewhat obscure document in which Dr. King had written about philanthropy. And he said the following: philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. And so, what Dr. King was saying was philanthropy, yes, is about charity and generosity, but it should also be about dignity and justice.
Hmm.
And that is a different paradigm. That's a paradigm that requires the philanthropist to examine their own complicity in the
Hmm.
very problems they have identified that they want to spend their
Yeah.
philanthropic
Yeah.
dollars solving.
Yeah. And looking at the root causes, which some philanthropy does, but not necessarily all of it. Then you share this with your board, with your staff. How did it sort of go over? I mean, now we can say it's a success, but I wonder, how did you get a group to come away with your way of thinking?
Well, I think it was a collective effort of a terrific staff here and a really remarkable board of trustees. Um, I think our board was uh, compelled by the idea that our work must center justice,
Mhm.
and that if we were to have a more just uh, America and a more just world, that we had to address the greatest threats to that. And
Mhm.
among those threats is inequality. And
Yeah.
so inequality became our North Star and became the fulcrum through which we examined what we would work on, where we would work, and how we would work as a foundation. And that, of course, led to a set of programmatic priorities
Mhm.
that include racial justice, the rights of women and gender issues, um, workforce and labor policy, the arts and culture, technology,
Mhm.
and society. Of
Mhm.
course, uh, expanding and strengthening civil society.
Mhm.
All of this in an effort to address inequality, because our uh, charge among the priorities that Henry Ford outlined for the Ford Foundation was to strengthen democracy.
Mhm.
And the correlation between inequality and democracy is is clear. In
Yeah.
societies where there
Yes.
is growing inequality, democracy unravels, democracy is
Absolutely.
diminished. And
Yeah.
so for us to have a vibrant, healthy democracy, which is in part our mission, we've got to address inequality, because inequality asphyxiates hope, and hope is the oxygen of democracy. So if we want inequality, if we want a more hopeful America, if we want a democracy that is strong and vibrant, we've got to take on inequality.
Yeah. And as you've done that, one of the things I've taken particularly interest in and love is in considering DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion. Um, we're two gay men. We think perhaps that's a minority, but I love with Ford, you really have focused on a fuller spectrum, including particularly I'm thinking around disabled community in a way that is in some ways, I think, still getting short shrift. And I think about things like the trans community, and the work is never done from my observation, but you really are on the front lines, you and your team.
Well, I think um, justice requires us, for example, to uh, bring the issue of disability and the rights of people with disabilities to live independent and full lives,
Mhm.
uh, for there to be full um, implementation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is still not being fully
On it.
administered across the country. Um, and that, of course, across sexual identity, that we need to respect and include everyone.
Yeah.
And so that's what it's about. It's about inclusion. And so this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion for us is an imperative. And it's not an imperative um, for some specious reason. It's an imperative because it's critical to being a high performing, excellent organization.
Yeah.
There is a correlation with excellence and diversity.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, today we have Darren Walker with us. He's the president of the Ford Foundation, the $16 billion global leading foundation. Darren, let's talk a little bit about polarization, because I think the Ford Foundation, are doing God's work, really. But you must be constantly also villainized and attacked as being woke, or being George Soros's buddies, or what have you. Like, rather than take sides on this, I wonder, what would you like the quote unquote other side to think or know or understand about what you're doing? How do we bridge that kind of misunderstanding? Are there any tricks to the trade you've learned in the past few decades?
Well, I think, Toby, that it is very regrettable that things that as recently as just a few years ago were not contested have become contested.
Hmm.
I believe that the work that we do and my own inspiration is deeply patriotic. I believe in America. My
Yep.
love for this country is unwavering. My commitment to the ideals, the words of our founding fathers. When Thomas Jefferson wrote to his friend Samuel DuPont and said, "The work of America is to build a just nation." Those words inspire me.
Mhm.
There is no doubt that Jefferson failed building a fully just nation, but he helped lay the foundation to fix some of the problems
Mhm.
that he and the founders were unwilling or unable to fix or repair. We have the tools to do that. And I believe that uh, those of us who are fighting, for example, to ensure that every American votes, is
Mhm.
engaged in the processes that determine their life opportunities, that these are fundamentally American ideas.
Mhm.
Who would not support the idea that we should do all we can to
Yep.
encourage all Americans to participate in the process of voting, which our founding fathers and generations of Americans have fought for,
Mhm.
have lost lives, given blood. And so I consider myself a very patriotic person who loves his country.
Mhm.
And because I love America, I believe in those words. And because I believe in those words, I want to hold America accountable
Mhm.
to deliver on those words for
Mhm.
everyone.
It's not lost on me. I mean, literally, as we speak, I think within the hour, former President Trump will be showing up at a courthouse in Georgia for allegedly help trying to stop that sacred right of voting in this country. It's just, we have to stay vigilant. I share your patriotism. I believe this is the greatest country on earth, but it requires all hands on deck, and a fair civic a civil way of engaging. So I like that you're working on that at Ford. What about your partners, so to speak? Philanthropy, as you well know and have said yourself, can't do it all, right? Philanthropy is a piece of it. It's a catalyst, but we talk mostly with private sector here about the bench strength, the talent, the deep pockets of the private sector. We also have nonprofits, but can you say a little bit about how you think about the rest of the world besides the philanthropic community in addressing these challenges, but particularly the business sector?
Well, our democracy depends on the three-legged stool and each leg being strong. Of course, the public sector, we need a functioning government and a system of governance that works for all. We need a civil society, the second leg in that stool, that is vibrant and resilient. And of course, we need a private sector. We live in a capitalist system. And my belief is that we need to ensure that capitalism works for more people. And capitalism, the ability of capitalism to work for more people is in part a function of policy, tax policy, economic policy. And so that interplay between democracy, the economy, economics, capitalism is critical to understand. If we want a nation with shared prosperity, which ought to be our objective. Unfortunately, Toby, we, over these last 40 to 50 years, have actually slid back. We know, again, this is incontrovertible. This is not a political statement to say that working Americans have lost ground, that life expectancy for some, including some white American communities and populations, have actually gone down.
Yes.
And so our economic system is not generating enough shared prosperity. It's generating inequality. And so we need to think about the way in which the private sector can help to solve this problem. And without the private sector, we won't be able to solve the problems. The innovation, the entrepreneurship, the ability and flexibility that the private sector brings is critical. And so it's one of the reasons we work on ideas like inclusive capitalism, conscious capitalism, and these notions that center our abiding belief in our capitalist system, but that belief is sobered by the reality of what the data tell us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm thinking, I was going to ask you some of your heroes or, successful examples of business leaders. I think of people like Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan or Larry Fink at BlackRock, maybe Jane Fraser, Citi. But A, do you have anyone you want to give a shout out to? And B, maybe we should talk about Detroit, because I think, JP Morgan was very much involved there, as was Ford. So first of all, two-part question. Do you have any heroes you might want to give a shout out to now? No pressure. And then,
well, I mean, in the private sector, there are absolutely heroes and sheroes. I think about a CEO like Ken Chenault at American Express, who is the gold standard of a CEO, in my view. Indra Nooyi at PepsiCo, where I have been a director, was a source of amazing transformation of that company. And as you say, you mentioned people in finance I respect and admire. But I absolutely believe that, my own heroes, Vernon Jordan, Calvin Butts, Ruth Simmons, are people who inspire me. And when I look, people often say, how do you remain hopeful? Because there are times when it is easy, Toby, to be dejected, demoralized, depressed. And yet, I am inspired when I think about the people whose shoulders I stand on and who made it possible for me to live a dream in some ways. The slaves, the enslaved people who were my ancestors could not have dreamed of my life. When I think about Fannie Lou Hamer, the great patriot who walked the dirt roads of Mississippi, carrying that American flag, professing her faith and her rage at America. She believed in this country. Frederick Douglass believed in America. So many more who are my heroes: Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Bayard Rustin. They believed in America, even though America did not seemingly believe in their full potential. And yet they believed in America. When I think about Langston Hughes's poem, my favorite poem, Let America Be America Again, he starts, let America be America again. America never was America to me. He is expressing his outrage at being marginalized and kept from his dreams because of his race in America. He ends that poem, but oh yes, someday America will be. Langston Hughes knew that in his lifetime, he would never see that America, but he believed. And so I stand on the shoulders of people like him who did believe. And therefore, how can I not believe?
There you go.
It would be dishonoring their legacy. It would be disrespecting the lives given and lost, the blood and tears by so many people who came before me and whose dreams I am now living. So, Toby, my friend, we have work to do in America, but I remain hopeful. I remain a believer in this idea, this experiment called America.
Ditto. You know, my friend, you cited two gentlemen, Ken Chenault, who I worked with at American Express when I was there, and board member Vernon Jordan. And I can remember before he died, I ran into him once at a meeting at Lazard, and to finally be able to shake his hand and say how much I admired him. This was, for our listeners who don't know him, what I loved about him. He was the quiet, unseen, elegant person that he was, of influence and seemingly egoless. But wow, I mean, I shared both those. I admire. I've approached Ken and tried to get him on my podcast. Maybe you'll help me get that. Two last questions. I'm mindful of time. One is, you and I know you are a recipient of the Order of the British Empire from the Queen before she passed, something I helped work on in my role at the consulate. Tell us what that meant to you. If no pressure, I mean, but it was an honor, and I wonder what you're going to say about that. And then on the other side, I want to ask you about any pearls of wisdom you might have. So, Her Majesty first.
Well, that was a tremendous honor, in part facilitated by my friend Toby. Thank you. It was unexpected. And of course, I cherish that recognition from Her Majesty, which came literally weeks before she passed away. I have proudly framed my investiture document with her signature prominently displayed because she was an extraordinary woman. who lived a life of loyalty and an unabiding faith.
And
Um,
service.
I am just a huge admirer. I
Good.
think pearls of wisdom, Toby, I'm probably short on. I don't profess to be any sort of a unique person in this regard. I think I have a lived experience that has taught me a couple of things. One, it is important to be authentically who you are and to live fully within that identity. And I'm so grateful that we live in a time, in spite of the setbacks and the deep concern we have about the state of things, when someone like me or you, me, a Black queer man, can aspire to
Mhm.
lead an organization like the Ford Foundation, which a generation ago would have been unthinkable.
Mhm.
Be authentic. Secondly, I believe in the idea of service. Service not to self, but service to country, service to community. I'm always inspired when I look back over history and I look at the men and women who inspired me to want to serve and hopefully be a servant leader. And finally, I would say the idea of leading with humility is important. Uh, to me, so many ways in our society, um, we see examples of arrogance, of mendacity,
Mhm.
of a narcissism in leaders that I don't believe are good models.
Mhm.
And we see this in the public and the private sectors. Um, and I don't believe that this is a trend that we should celebrate. I think it's something that we should work very hard against, to protect the idea that the most noble calling is the humble servant leader. And to do that with honor and with dignity and with courage. I try. I don't fully succeed at it, but I certainly have that as my North Star. And those would be pearls of wisdom, if you will, that I would want to share.
Well, they're inspiring, and you definitely embody those. And I like you, I try to embody those as well. So I can't thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. Today we've had Darren Walker on, the president of the Ford Foundation, a real catalytic force, both the foundation and Darren, in a better tomorrow, and really wonderful today with the way he conducts himself and takes others along with him. So thank you, Darren Walker.
Thank you, Toby.